Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maple. So today I want to talk a little bit about administering surveys and focus in on question design. Now I've already mentioned this a little bit, but the bulk of surveys that we do today are online surveys. They are the most common thing. And it's really cool because when I was in graduate school, we were transitioning away from mail surveys to phone surveys. And then by the end of graduate school, we were transitioning away from phone surveys to online surveys. The availability of the internet, the frequency at which people had the internet available in their households by the time I graduated I think it was 2011ish or something from my PhD. When I graduated, it was really exciting, and the cell phone also impacted that because we went from a period where the phone book had a listing of everyone pretty much that lived in a community because it listed all the landlines, and we could use that for mail surveys, so we could really sample a community. But as people increasingly use cell phones wouldn't be listed in the phone books, and as a result, the phone book went from this massive document that I used to get in the mail, and it was actually something that you wanted to hold on to because it was kind of important, to it's now irrelevant. In fact, we have the internet that we could look up all sorts of information about where businesses are, or even in some cases what people's phone numbers are, because a lot of that stuff is still online. Nonetheless, the bulk of the surveys that we distribute are now online, and I want to point out that as an EKU student, while you're here, you actually have free access to something we call Qualtrics. Qualtrics is a leading platform for offering online surveys. It's simple, it's quick, and there's about a bazillion YouTube videos out there about how to design surveys in Qualtrics. I will save the conversation about building a survey in Qualtrics for a different class, but if you ever need to do that, you let me know and I'll be happy to help you. SurveyMonkey is also another really good example, but I will warn you that free version of SurveyMonkey doesn't actually give you access to your data. It gives you a summary of that data. So that may not be useful to you. The free version of Qualtrics doesn't exist unless you're at the university, so that's kind of another thing to keep in mind. Now, with surveys, a core idea is that everyone is more or less getting the same questions. We don't ask them impromptu questions, or they don't really change from person to person to person. What we generally do is give the same survey to everyone. But there's going to be instances where maybe a question doesn't apply to someone. I'll give you a good example. If we were to ask people about their experiences riding roller coasters at Dollywood, we asked them to rate their roller coaster experience on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being awesome, 1 being horrible, but they've never rode the roller coasters there, it doesn't really help us. They're going to either skip the question, which doesn't tell us anything, or they're going to lie, and that's going to give us bad data. But what we could do is set up some questions that allow us to skip them. In fact, we call this a skip logic, skip question, a logic question, a filter question is what the textbook calls it. You will probably hear me call it a skip question or a skip logic question because that's usually just what I was taught to use. But the idea is that we can skip over certain people based on our questions. In fact, let's kind of look at this. Let's pretend that we're doing a survey where we want to find out about people's experiences at Dollywood. Now, what I could do is start with a skip question. My very first question on my survey could be, have you ever been to Dollywood? And if you say, yes, I have, then I can set up my online survey or my printed survey so that you're told to answer question 2 next. And if you say, no, I've never been to Dollywood, then on an online survey, I could actually end your survey. I could say, okay, thank you. You don't qualify to be taking this survey, and I could exclude you. Or I could route you to some other question where maybe later in the survey, I'll ask you things that are relevant about the amusement park industry, but not specifically about Dollywood. This is a skip question in action. Again, I can skip over people that haven't been to Dollywood, and I can still collect data from people who have been to Dollywood. So if you have been to Dollywood, then I can say, great, when did you last go to Dollywood? Please list the month and year. And then I can ask you more questions about that. I could even have skip questions that ask, did you ride roller coasters? Did you ride a specific roller coaster? Did you buy anything in terms of the retail shops there? And I can use those to skip over certain questions that I do or don't want you to ask. Skip questions are really great because they let us design a uniform survey that works for everyone. It's also a really good introductory spot for thinking about why we need to make our surveys very functional, very reliable devices that collect good data. Because if you ask people questions that they can't experience and you don't give them an answer that works to get them out of that, you have a problem in your data. Now, by the way, another way that you could have addressed this without a skip logic question, you could have said, when did you last go to Dollywood? Please list the month and year if possible. If you've never been to Dollywood, please put NA. So you're kind of building your skip question into the question. But do you see why we need to make sure our questions are measuring stuff like that and make sure that we're getting good responses? We want to make sure that people are taking this survey and can give us very true, honest answers. Let's look at a couple other question designs. So let's think about some very common, straightforward approaches to question design. The first one is what we call a closed question. With a closed question, I give you all the possible answers. So you tell me, student, what is your current class rank? Are you a fresh person, a sophomore, junior, a senior, a graduate student? Prefer not to answer, or perhaps I'm not a college student at all. I just discovered this link to this lecture somehow and I'm watching it anyways. You can answer that. You could tell me exactly which one of those describes you. This is a closed question. I have given you every possible answer. I have closed off the possible answers that you could give me into these specific categories. But here's where design matters. I want to make sure that I give you good categories. I want to make sure that they are two things, exhaustive and mutually exclusive. Exhaustive means that I've covered all the options. So if I asked this question, I say, what's your current class rank? Fresh person, sophomore, I'm not sure. What have I missed? Junior, senior, graduate students. This question is no good at this point because the data I'm going to get probably isn't very good. That's because it's not an exhaustive question. I didn't cover all of the bases. I closed off my answers because it's a closed question, but I didn't close off all the bases that needed to be covered. Likewise, mutually exclusive or mutual exclusivity, as you'll sometimes hear it called, means that I need to make sure none of my categories overlap. Is there any possibility that you could check more than one option? For example, could you ever be a fresh person and a sophomore and a junior and a fresh person and a senior, a graduate student and a sophomore? Could any of these categories ever possibly overlap? If they can, we've got to either restructure the question so that you can check all that apply, which is sometimes fine, or we've got to make sure that we can split up our categories so that they are mutually exclusive. Again, basic question design, but making sure that you cover all the bases. And one of the things that I'll point out too is including a prefer not to answer or an I'm not sure, as well as a not sure at all. You can put these kinds of things in there to make sure you've covered the blanks, or even putting in an other and fill in the blank to make sure you've covered all the blanks. It's a perfectly acceptable way to do that. Another way to approach a closed question is to open it up to all sorts of answers. This makes things more complicated for you. We'll talk about this with coding a little later. But an open question lets people answer in their own words. For example, in your own words, how would you describe your experience at Dollywood today? And then you could just write all down. I had a really great time. I loved the roller coasters. The bathrooms were awesome. I just wish that there were more roller coasters. That's great. The next person could have a completely wildly different answer. But with an open question, I'm not limiting them. I'm saying in your own words, how do you feel about this? Likewise, we can do this even with a closed question. So let's pretend I'm asking them about a festival that they may be attended. Which of the following events did you attend on your trip? Did you go to the music festival? Okay, you could check that. Did you go to the Blacksmith Festival? Okay, check that. Another festival that was there, fill in the blank. This is our other category. So now they can, in their own words, answer this. This gives us a chance to give an open question within a closed question. Open questions are really great because you can put these in there and hear people's own thoughts. I always like to add these, especially at the very end of the survey, where I'll say, thank you for taking this survey. Below is a box where we'd love to hear your thoughts about the survey or about anything that we didn't ask you about. Please feel free to put your notes below. Otherwise, thank you for completing our survey. And this gives people a chance to point out all sorts of things. It's cool too, because every once in a while they'll point out a typo in the survey, or maybe a question that was weirdly phrased, or maybe even something that was in addition to what you asked about. Maybe they want to tell you about how awesome that Blacksmith Festival was, or how much they enjoyed the roller coasters at Dollywood. And sometimes they draw pretty pictures for you. That's a common thing that I see with in-person surveys. Nonetheless, with closed and open questions, we can answer a whole bunch of questions that we have about a population. And using skip questions or logic questions, we can skip around the kinds of questions that people have to answer so that we get good data. Now, Likert items give us a really cool opportunity to adapt the closed question to measuring the strength of an emotion. Likert items you've seen your whole life. They are the questions where you're saying that you strongly agree with things. You do things never through very frequently to often. You basically are ranking them. Now, this is interesting because we've gone from where a closed question would just be nominal data to a Likert is actually ordinal, and even in some cases, a sociologist would treat it as interval or ratio data. It's a meaningful numeric value. If you strongly disagree, when we code it later on, which we'll learn about that in an upcoming lecture, you give it a 1, and if you strongly agreed with it, you give it a 5. We can average those out, and if we get like a 4.3, then we know people generally agree with a statement. Now, with a Likert matrix, which is why we sometimes call them matrix questions, we list a bunch of items, and for each of these, you strongly agree to strongly agree, or some similar scale that is, increasing in frequency or increasing in strength of response. Let's pretend that I did a quick Likert matrix that had to do with EKU, and I could ask you things like, tell me if you strongly agree to strongly disagree with, there's plenty of student parking at EKU. I like the food at the EKU cafeteria. EKU has a great library. You could say if you strongly disagree, or neutral, you agree, strongly agree with each of these. Likewise, you could make this into a larger measure. So this is what we call the 5-point item. With those 5 measures, you can make this into a 7-point by having strongly agree, somewhat disagree, disagree, neutral, and so forth. You can add levels into that. I've even seen 10-point ones, but really once you get above 5, there's not a lot of benefit to it. One other thing that I'll point out too is you'll notice that the first 3 questions that I gave here all seem to go in the same direction. Like, let's pretend that each of these it's just you reacting to a statement, and they're all kind of going the same direction of, you can disagree with this, you can disagree with this, you can disagree with this. But that last one changes its phrasing. It uses the word inadequate instead of adequate. So you can see the first one, there's plenty of parking. Well, that's a positive thing. I like the food. That's a positive thing. It's a great library. That's a positive thing. Inadequate living quarters. That's a bad thing. This is actually what we call a negative coded question. Negative coded questions are really cool because it gives you a chance to see if people are actually reading your surveys. You could even take an earlier item that you've listed and reverse it and test people on that. So I could have my first question being, there's plenty of student parking at EKU. And then a later question could be like, there's no parking at EKU. And I could see if people caught that it was reverse coded, because if they don't, they probably weren't reading it, and I might throw out their survey. By the way, they do those in teaching evaluations too, if you haven't noticed those. They throw in a couple of reverse coded, and if you don't pay attention to that, sometimes they exclude your case or your responses. Negative coded is fun because it does that, but it also means too that you can have some different responses to it and get people engaged with the responses to the survey. And also it gives you a chance too that when you recode it, it just all will still flow the same way. So you'll actually go through the process of recoding the data, something that we'll learn to do at the end of the semester, so that the 1 was now equal to a 5 and everything is now going the same direction. We'll get more experience with that a little later. Let's look at what a physically visual matrix looks like. These are actually some example questions that I borrowed from a survey that I'm doing in the Shell TOEI this year. So I asked people to respond to these and say if they disagreed or agreed with the statement, I visit the Shell TOEI to ... So the first one is, I visit the Shell TOEI to enjoy my favorite activity, to enjoy beautiful scenery, to relax, to experience peace and tranquility. For each of these, they can say that they strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. And in the end, I'll have a very useful numeric value that I can use to understand what people really have to say. So those are a couple of basic ways that we can create questions. We talked about the skip question, we talked about closed questions, open questions, and now the Likert matrix. These are the basic approaches to building questions. In our next lecture, what I want to do is start thinking about some of the ways that we administer surveys, some basic advice for that, and also some of the pitfalls that we might fall into with building those questions. If you have questions or concerns, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I'll see you in our next lecture. Take care.